there's a way to make an entrance.
This is my destiny.
It was now a conspiracy of witches.
Download Veely today.
Come with us on a musical journey through some of the most magnificent places on earth. Great towns and cities of Europe, steeped in history and beauty, and resounding with the stories and music of the world's greatest composers. Handel, Debussy, Rossini, Chopin, Elgar, Rachmaninoff. Just some of the greats in our classical destinations. Hello, I'm Simon Callow and welcome to Classical Destinations. We're in Munich, a city in love with art, fine art, architecture, drama, music, opera. This is the Opera House. Built in 1813, burned to the ground in 1923, rebuilt. Bombed in 1945, rebuilt in 1963, one of the greatest and most beautiful opera houses in the world. It's Munich's premier classical music venue, home to Bavaria's State Opera Company and the Bavarian State Orchestra. It's also a very important place in the history of German opera and in the lives of the two composers we're about to meet. Richard Wagner and Richard Strauss each turned the opera world upside down. Wagner with his massive productions, so big they eventually required that a dedicated theatre be built, and Strauss with his realistic depictions of depravity, which, initially at least, caused uproar. Their lives overlapped by nearly 20 years. Strauss was an impressionable and exceptionally talented boy as Wagner was striding boldly across opera's stage. But through his own remarkable achievements in opera, he would go on to be crowned Richard II. Strauss saw a number of Wagner's operas here in Munich, including Siegfried, which at the tender age of 14 he described as utter chaos. Not too many years later, he was appointed the third assistant conductor here. Only the third assistant, perhaps, but nevertheless, a brilliant career was gathering momentum. With its rich history, architectural splendor, and superb acoustics, Munich's Opera House is among the most important in Europe. The city is a wonderful blend of the old and the new. The city was founded in the middle of the 13th century. It's been the capital of Bavaria since 1503, but today it's the glittering center of Germany's high-tech industries. Yet at its very heart is the historic Marienplatz, where everything is so beautifully preserved or restored it's like walking through a living museum. It's also a hive of activity, and it's where the young Strauss came to listen to open-air concerts. Marienplatz is where Munich was born. It was originally a market where the hugely valuable medieval commodities of salt and corn were traded. There are still markets here, and the fabulous food on sale is a reminder that there's much more to Bavaria than just good beer. There's not much left of Munich's medieval fortifications, but the Karlstor, Karl's Gate, survives at the western end of the Marienplatz. One thing hasn't changed. You still get around on foot. No cars allowed. The residents of Munich take their recreation very seriously indeed. In fact, the city is ranked as one of the best for quality of life. There's the beer, the trout fishing, the gardens, lying around in the sun, and the surfing. These artificial waves may not be very big, but at least they're predictable. Even more surprising is that this is happening right in the middle of the city, in a huge public park called the Englischer Garten, the English Garden. Oh well, that explains it all. Opened in 1808, this park has two beer gardens in it, one traditional, the other with a massive Chinese pagoda in the middle of it. Munich is certainly full of surprises. Richard Strauss was the last of the great German Romantic composers. He was born here in Munich in 1864, and he died in 1949, 85 years old. He lived through 2 world wars. He saw the collapse of both the German and the Austrian empires, the rise and fall of Hitler, and the destruction by savage bombing of his own city, Munich. He started as a great firebrand of a composer, a radical, challenging, dissonant. He mellowed into something much more mellifluous. But his music stands absolutely at the center of the modern repertory. His orchestral music, the tone poems, his operatic masterpieces, his concertos, and his songs. It's absolutely fitting that he should be celebrated here in his own city by this memento of one of his greatest operas, Salome. Scenes from her life are illustrated in this fountain. And how very, very fitting that she, that Jewish princess, should be celebrated by klezmer musicians. Here in what is now the Residence Museum is this amazing grotto, late 16th century, built by Wilhelm V, Elector of Bavaria, celebrating the gods in Olympus, scenes taken from Ovid's Metamorphoses, a celebration of a golden age, all wiped out by the bombs. And here, in the courtyard of the grotto, was the very first concert heard after the war in Munich, among the rubble. Dukes, duchesses, princes, princesses, emperors, empresses, kings, queens, the golden corridors of power. Richard Strauss was very familiar with all this. From an early age, he'd had money, awards, medals showered on him, and now suddenly it was all wiped out. Here, in this extraordinary celebration and summary of the classical world, with its gods and goddesses, its emperors and its generals, here the devastation was greatest, almost totally wiped out by a single bomb which fell 2/3 down this hall. You can still see the dip where it fell. This fairy tale palace complex was home to the Wittelsbachs, the rulers of Bavaria, for 500 years. It started as a modest moated castle, and they just kept on adding to it. A new chapel here, a new hall there. In the end, there were 130 rooms, 10 courtyards, 2 very impressive theatres, and a lovely formal garden. Nymphenburg Castle was so named because it was dedicated to Flora, the goddess of flowers, and her nymphs. Not surprisingly, then, the gardens are just as magnificent as the ornate Italianate palace itself. This magnificent 18th century ceiling was painted by the 76-year-old Herr Zimmermann at the behest of the Prince Elector of Bavaria, Maximilian Emanuel, and completed by his son, Karl Albrecht, who was no less than the pretender to the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. He was rather defeated in that ambition by Maria Theresia of Austria, but nevertheless, the ambition was grand. He was the last absolute monarch of Bavaria. This was his palace. In this room, concerts were held, and they still are today. But just down the corridor, in a little room, was born the future Ludwig II of Bavaria, Wagner's great patron. This is Munich's Prince Regent Theatre, and as you see, it's dedicated to German art, fittingly, since the interior is modelled after Richard Wagner's great auditorium in Bayreuth, radical, innovatory auditorium with no balconies, thus eliminating, as he hoped, class divisions. Interestingly enough, Richard Strauss's father, the greatest horn player of his day, Franz Strauss, played in many of the first performances of Wagner's operas, and he loathed the music, absolutely loathed it, but it didn't stop him from taking his little son, Richard, with him to see Parsifal at Bayreuth at a performance attended by Wagner himself. Later, Strauss became a resident conductor in Bayreuth, got to know Cosima Wagner, Wagner's widow, and there was some talk of him perhaps becoming engaged to Wagner's daughter Eva, but that didn't happen. However, in 1933, when Hitler came to power, Toscanini, as a mark of protest, refused to conduct at Bayreuth. And Richard Strauss, not because he liked the Nazis, but because of his great, enduring affection for the work of Richard Wagner, agreed to take over, thus proving beyond any doubt his commitment to the older composer's music. Believe it or not, it's the annual summer Munich Opera Festival, and nothing will deter the audiences here from getting their opera. Tonight, it's the Flying Dutchman. There's incredible excitement in the air. I have my ticket. I'm going in. I know I'm going to enjoy it. Bye-bye. All his life, Strauss was in love with the soprano voice. Here's one of his most famous songs, Morgen, with the Australian Chamber Orchestra and Sarah McIver. While Richard Strauss is best known for his operas, he wrote a huge amount of other music. He was a prolific songwriter, and here an important influence was Goethe, the great German poet and philosopher. Like so many of the Romantic-era composers, the deep philosophical questions of life were often woven into Strauss's music. Strauss's music followed an interesting path. The earliest influences were classical, the Holy Trinity of Mozart, Beethoven, and Haydn. So Strauss began as a conservative. Then he became daringly adventurous in his 20s and 30s. This is the period of Elektra and Salome. Before, his reputation now firmly established, he felt less of a need to challenge his audiences. And despite his father's deep loathing of Wagner, which undoubtedly colored those disdainful, youthful opinions, Strauss became the great Wagnerian exponent and interpreter. When he eventually returned to the Munich Opera House in 1894, now as its director and chief conductor, the program for the next 4 years was dominated by the operas of Wagner and Mozart. It's a wonderful auditorium. The acoustic is quite remarkable. I sat just a few rows back last night when I came in out of the howling storms and the rain to see The Flying Dutchman, a score which, of course, is full of howling gales and rain, as the first conductor of it reported. He said when he opened the score at the overture, the rain and the howling gales just came right up at him. It felt like that last night. Incidentally, there's no relation at all between Richard Strauss and the Austrian waltz kings Johann Strauss I and Johann Strauss II. Richard Strauss considered the father's music trivial, but greatly admired Johann the Younger's opera Die Fledermaus. In the foyer, there are busts of a trinity of composers who are sacred to this house. Mozart, who, as it happens, wrote Idomeneo for Munich, though not, of course, for this theatre. Wagner, who did write Tristan and Die Walküre and Das Rheingold for this house, and Munich's favorite musical son, Richard Strauss. A kind of a shadow lies over Richard Strauss's reputation. In 1933, when Hitler came to power, many German artists either left the country or protested strongly. Richard Strauss did neither. Indeed, he accepted a position as the director of Hitler's Reichsmusikkammer, a kind of state music bureau. And throughout the succeeding years, he often performed for Hitler. He wrote an Olympic hymn for the 1936 Olympic Games, which he also conducted. Partly, this is due to a certain political naivete. He was by no means a Nazi, disliked Hitler and didn't like the regime, but he didn't regard it as any part of his job to protest. He even did something very brave, which is that he wrote his opera, The Silent Woman, with a Jewish librettist, Stefan Zweig, and then he fell very badly out of favor with the Nazi regime. But he had, you must remember, a Jewish daughter-in-law, and it's probably true that he kept a fairly low profile to protect her. Indeed, in 1938, he wrote an opera, first performed here in Munich, called Friedenstag, which was a plea for peace, a fairly bold thing to do in 1938 in Hitler's Germany. He found his operatic feet, so to speak, in 1905 with Salome, which burst onto a shocked world. It was a huge, huge sensation, denounced from pulpits everywhere, but people flocked to it, enabling Strauss, as he wryly observed, to buy himself a very nice villa in Garmisch. Strauss's great love of the mountains grew out of family holidays he'd enjoyed so much as a small boy in the Tyrol region, and then later here in the majestic Bavarian Alps. Garmisch is situated at the foot of the Zugspitze, Germany's highest mountain, though in fact one half of it is actually in Austria. In winter, this is a mecca for skiers. In summer, it celebrates music with festivals for military bands, traditional Bavarian folk songs, and of course, works of Richard Strauss. Wealthier than he'd ever been before, thanks to Salome, Strauss was able to afford an architecturally designed villa here, which was completed in 1908. It was initially only going to be a summer retreat, but he loved it here so much that it became the Strauss family home in Germany, and a welcome refuge during the troubled years of the Second World War. On the last day of April 1945, the whole family was here when the advancing American troops arrived. Strauss's son came to the door and was told that the villa would be requisitioned. He summoned his father. The old man came out falteringly and asked the soldiers, did they know who he was? He explained that he was Richard Strauss, the composer of Der Rosenkavalier, of Salome, of Elektra, of Also sprach Zarathustra. Fortunately, one of the officers recognized him, standing at the door, and thereafter a respectful sign reading "Off Limits" was fixed to the gate. Garmisch, too, has honored its most famous citizen with a truly wonderful museum and research center. In fact, it's not so much a museum as a celebration, for here you get a real sense of the man and his music. There are scores marked in his hand, set models, photographs, personal possessions, including a classic travel case, and a collection of every recording of his music ever made. And in the shop downstairs, you can add to your own collection. Richard Strauss died peacefully in his sleep at the villa in Garmisch on the 8th of September, 1949. He was 85. Just a few short months before, he'd still been making recordings and had even conducted part of his opera Der Rosenkavalier at Munich's Prinz Regent Theater. It was a truly remarkable life. Controversial at times, some of that controversy just won't go away, but Richard Strauss's musical achievement can never be questioned. We can't leave Bavaria without heading a little further west into the Alps from Garmisch to see something truly breathtaking. Perennially hard up, Richard Wagner found an enthusiastic and extravagantly wealthy sponsor in the young King Ludwig II. Remember that they had first met in Munich's lavish residence in 1864. Ludwig, just 18, had been king for 3 months, and he fell for Wagner completely. In 1869, Ludwig started building this as his summer retreat. The fantastical Schloss Neuschwanstein has been the inspiration for every fairy tale castle since. It took 17 years to complete. Ludwig loved Wagner and his music so much that he financed much of Wagner's dream opera house at Bayreuth and frequently paid the composer's rent. Pronounced insane in 1886 and deposed, Ludwig drowned mysteriously in a lake just south of Munich along with his psychiatrist. And here's a final twist in the tale. This very same psychiatrist had once treated Richard Strauss's mother. Ludwig was another colorful chapter in Wagner's life, and Richard Wagner was certainly a very colorful chapter in the history of music.
Every summer, the Munich Opera hosts an opera festival. You may also have heard of the famous Munich Beer Festival. Oddly enough, they're not unconnected. This very opera house was built by a subscription raised by the imposition of 1 pfennig on every pint of beer consumed. Art and beer, holding hands, a first, perhaps. Goodbye from Classical Destinations. See you soon.
Now we're on the move again. Our next stop is Budapest to meet one of the most significant composers of the 19th century, Franz Liszt. It's going to be another fascinating classical destination.